А что за Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are studying our presentation. Today is a new, relatively new representative of pioneer to Russian Federation, Bikas Joshi. And the topic of today's discussion, I assume, maybe you know I am not right, would be the uncertainty. Uncertainty in the world economy, uncertainty in Russian economy. What is likely clear now, and we can cross our fingers, that US Congress and US President filed an agreement about potential technical default of the United States, at least for the current 6 months. So hopefully we shouldn't worry about it, but nevertheless, there are a lot of structural problems, problems with unemployment, problems with economic growth. So I think we won't be able to answer all the questions, but nevertheless, I think Mr. Joshi would describe us the current situation, and afterwards, kindly, I hope, answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much and welcome. I am honored to be speaking in front of you tonight, and many thanks to Professor Vasily Solodkov for inviting me to this event. First, apologies. I actually, to tell you the truth, I love presentations. I like spending a lot of time in designing nice presentations. Just didn't have time this time. So next time I do this here, I promise I will make up for it with nice charts and graphs and things for you to look at. Unfortunately, tonight I have just written things. I'll describe this for now. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Bikas Joshi. I am the new head of the resident mission of the International Monetary Fund in Russia. I arrived here back in July, and I've sort of been spending the last 3 months basically just engaging with people, government authorities, academics, investors, thought leaders, about sort of economic interactions in Russia. So I'm actually kind of delighted to explore a new crowd here of this audience, which is actually larger than I had imagined it would be at this place of learning. In a way, actually, I have to admit that I've actually spent a lot of my sort of very little free time that I have lately going through the various websites of the Higher School of Economics, looking at different departments and centers, looking at analytical work that seems to be done here. I was telling Vasily how I was kind of confused because there are lots of centers and lots of different faculties, and there are lots of interesting work being done, but just trying to understand the theme of what was being done. But it's been very interesting. Before coming here, I used to do analytical work, so I kind of want to engage with people here on those issues as well, and perhaps continue that in the period ahead. So I've actually learned a lot from engaging with people here already. One of them, Martin Gilman, for instance, particularly because he used to do my job like 15 years ago. So his perspective is very unique and very relevant for me right now, but talking to others has been very useful too. So earlier today also I was at the Higher School of Economics, but at the other location. One of the things, I accompanied someone from our Human Resources Department to talk about the IMF as an attractive place to work, talking about what is needed, what are the skills needed, how you need to be prepared, and so on. And basically, again, since there's a student community here, make the pitch here. An institution like the IMF can benefit from diversity of views, and diversity of views comes from diversity of education. And those of you educated in a place like this would be very valuable addition to an institution like the IMF. I don't think any of you here were at the presentation this morning, but you will please feel free to go to the IMF website as you finish your master's and PhD and see what's bachelor's too, and see what's available. And perhaps at some point I could do an information session just on that as well, just to kind of let you know what's out there, just to consider that as an option. And if you go to our website, you'll see there's some information on there as well. And feel free to, I'm happy to answer questions in that regard. Okay. But tonight is not about trying to tempt you to come to work at the IMF. When Vasily asked me to speak, I agreed because the invitation was very timely. This is because just last week, central bank governors and finance ministers from all over the world met in Washington, D.C. for the IMF World Bank annual meetings, 188 members. They held many different discussions, bilateral ones, small groups, and large plenary sessions. And they focused on sort of challenges facing the global economy and the role that each member country of the IMF has to play to get growth going. And as is a tradition, at the same time, the IMF also released 3 of their sort of semi-annual flagship products, what we call flagship products. The World Economic Outlook, the Global Financial and Stability Report. So the World Economic Outlook we refer to as the WEO, Global Financial Stability Report, GFSR, and the Fiscal Monitor. So looking at overall macro, financial stability, and the fiscal sustainability aspects. If you have time, I would recommend that you take a look at those reports. They're actually well written and could be very useful as well. In addition, it was also accompanied by a new product, what we call the Managing Director's Global Policy Agenda. So that's something that we create to outline what are the policy challenges at the moment for the IMF and for the membership as a whole, global membership, and what the IMF needs to do and what we think the members need to do, emerging markets, advanced economies, low-income countries, what are the challenges? And then last but certainly not the least, last week was also where Russia in Washington, D.C. held the last of its G20 ministerial meeting. And I say that because one of my responsibilities in my last job was to coordinate IMF's inputs into the G20, so it's a little near and dear to my heart. So as of December 1, they'll pass this on to Australia. So I'll talk mostly about the IMF reports, but I'm happy to speak about the G20 as well, because that's something I've been doing for the last 3 years. So with that background, let me just point out what I'm going to talk about tonight. So what I'll start off with is I'll start off by outlining how the IMF sees the global agenda and how we think Russia is placed in that broader context, bringing in risks as well. I'll highlight policy challenges faced by emerging and advanced economies, and then implications of those things for Russia. And I'll also flag the results of our annual, let's call it economic health checkup, or what we call the Article 4 report, which was, so we came back in June to discuss with the authorities. So this is something that we do for each one of our 188 members. Annually, we consult with the authorities, with academics, with investors, with other people, civil society, on the state of the economy, and prepare a report that deals with sort of the consistency of policies and challenges and so on. So we did one for Russia. The board meeting was held a few weeks ago. And the report will be published actually within the next few days. So I can alert you to that when that comes out. But I'll hot flag some of the issues that we highlight there as well. So let me begin first with the global economy. So the IMF's Global Economic Outlook notes that the world economy has entered another transition. So that's what they call. So the transition is that back in July, we were talking about 3-speed growth. We were talking about this growth where U.S. was picking up speed, Japan was too, Europe was stagnant, and then there was the emerging market as an engine of growth. What's changed since then is that there's been this turnaround. The advanced economies are gradually strengthening, but the growth in the emerging markets have slowed. So that's the transition. The WIO now projects the global economy to grow at 2.9% in 2013 and 3.6% in 2014. And that's slightly weaker than the last forecast released in July. So what we do normally is we release the big flagships come out at our annual meetings, which are in October, and our spring meetings, which are in April. And in between, we have updates. So we had a data release in April and an update in July, and now one in October. So growth in advanced economies at 1.2% in 2013 and basically 2% in 2014. It remains unchanged relative to the July numbers. This is due to sort of positive private demand in the U.S. Remaining strong, sort of temporary rebound in Japan, and recovery from recession in the euro area. Right. So if you look at the developments in the euro area, in 2011, I think more than half the countries were in recession. Last year, about a third were in recession, and next year we project almost all of them to kind of come out of recession. So the question there is not, well, there's recovery from recession. The growth is not, high, but it's not negative for the most part now. So on the other hand, many emerging markets are coming off their cyclical highs. Right? So in recent years, they've grown very fast, but while their growth still remains much higher than in advanced economies, it has slowed down. So we're projecting it to be below their kind of historically, your BRICS and other EMs have grown very fast. They're still high. They're still much higher than advanced economies, but they're lower than before. So as a whole, we project emerging market economies to grow around 4.5% in 2013 and about 5.1% in 2014. For each year, it's an adjustment of about 0.5 percentage point down. And in that context, if you read the WEO, the World Economic Outlook, you'll see there's a box on BRICS looking at using a common modeling tool across all, Brazil, China, Russia, India, and South Africa, and showing how the extent of structural versus cyclical reasons for the slowdown in these economies. So with these changing growth dynamics, the WEO points out that the risk remains on the downside. So, and underscoring that the risks to the emerging markets are more prominent. The recent tightening of financial conditions, once the talk of tapering began in the United States, it embodies some of these risks, right? So several emerging market countries saw large capital outflows, they saw long-term interest rate increases, and they saw exchange rate depreciation in May when it was announced, and they've leveled off a bit, but it hasn't come back fully yet. And in that context, thank God the U.S. debt impasse was resolved as of this morning. I went to bed last night following the story, and I think I went to bed when Senate passed the bill, and then I woke up this morning just as the House was passing the bill. And so I was very relieved because I knew otherwise all the questions here was going to be about, what do you think of the impact of the impasse? What do you think if the U.S. defaults? So at least for now, we've avoided that question for 6 months. But it remains very important that a stable financing environment in the U.S. is crucial for the world economy. And I think the developments in the last 16 days underscored the fact that how the global environment relies so crucially still on developments in the U.S. So these challenges, actually, the fiscal monitor, again, stresses that notwithstanding, there's a lot of heterogeneity within the group, but emerging markets face a much worsened borrowing environment with higher spreads. With advanced economies, it shows how the level of vulnerability remains high, but debt has stabilized generally at a much higher level right now. And then the Global Financial Stability Report, the GFSR, also notes that going forward, addressing these challenges would be paramount for the policymakers. So in the very near term, again, the U.S. fiscal policy remains the most important issue, right? We've avoided one bullet, but it's we still have the January-February deadline. It's going to come up very soon. So any resumption in uncertainty will have significant impact on emerging markets, on the U.S., and by implication by spillovers on the global economy as well. While, as I said, the period of negative growth in the euro area has ended, the growth looking forward still remains very subdued, which doesn't give the emerging European countries the engine that it needs to grow out of, to reinvigorate its growth by using trade. So there's that. Now turning to Russia. So in a step back, it's in this global context that the developments in Russia should be seen. We currently project Russian growth to be at 1.5% in 2013 and about 3% in 2014. The 1.5% stands in very stark contrast to the 2.5% that we projected in July when we were there, and actually 3.4% that we projected back in April. So it's a very sharp downturn. But to underscore, this reflects the developments since early this year, in the first half of the year, and it's actually broadly in line with what the analysts have said. So the one thing is, there's been there's been some talk of this difference between our 1.5 and the Ministry of Economy's 1.8. And on the one hand, it's a forecast. 0.3 is not a big issue. It's not a big difference. On the other, it embodies. I'll outline this. Some small differences in assumptions, and which I think may be born as you look at the Q3 numbers. The resumption may not be as big as we had anticipated. So, in the first half, as you know, there was strong wage growth and credit growth, which supported consumption, but investment was not as strong, particularly in manufacturing and construction, and that was the drag in the first half of the year. While oil prices remained high, the external environment again was weakening, so it didn't provide that engine of growth. So for the second half, what we assume is that we assume agricultural rebound and other factors will be a plus on the growth side. And then, but of course, the extent of this rebound needs to be seen. As I said, some of the Q3 numbers so far, the retail sales that came out today, unemployment still remains high. So we don't have that sort of the sharp upturn that one would want yet. So these revisions imply a small output gap of about maybe a little over 0.5% of GDP. We calculate that with various tools like statistical methods. But at the same time, if you look at unemployment, it remains near its historical lows. The latest data today saw an uptick by just 0.1%. Capacity utilization remains high, and inflation still, it's still at the upper end of the target range, right? So there's still the indications of slack in the economy is not there yet. Now for Russia, we also think the risks are on the downside. So far, Russia has been affected much less than its emerging market peers, given its sort of limited interconnections to the global economy and ample buffers. But the same undiversified structure which limits this interconnectedness also is a source of risk. You can see energy exports in Russia account for about 65% of total goods export. If you look at commodities in general, it's about 85%. So any shifts in that is a risk. So if there's a downturn in global economic conditions leading to a decline in these prices, obviously there's a risk. Oil prices, they've fallen below their peaks of March 2012, but they still remain high. So that's supporting the economy. But as you'll see, in the Article 4 report when it comes out, one of the things we do is we run. So the way we do things is we have a baseline scenario based on advised policies, or what we think might be proper policies to undertake. And then we also, in most countries, and again in the case of Russia, we have upside scenarios and downside scenarios. So the upside scenarios will embody the things I'll talk later in this lecture of what we think Russia should do in the medium and long term. The downside scenario is what happens if the risks materialize, right? And we see that in our scenario, it's our downside risk scenario is sharp and permanent drop in oil prices, say because of shale revolution of some sort, and that could have a huge implication in this model on external and fiscal accounts of Russia, and possibly even lead to higher capital outflows. And then additional domestic risks we identified are investment climate, and then slow progress with structural reforms that would undermine, domestic demand and growth. So given this, the big message of the Article 4 report is that, and I'll say this repeatedly tonight, it may sound like a cliche, but it's that to attain a higher growth, Russia needs a new growth model. So the growth model of the last decade that relied on rising oil prices and increasing capacity is no longer replicable. So we're at a stage where that pump cannot be primed anymore. So something else needs to happen. To give credit, the policy frameworks have improved considerably in Russia. You know this probably better than I do, but with much better fiscal institutions, much better monetary institutions, and improvements in recent months as well. But Russia's weak business climate remains an obstacle to generating high investment. And then, as a result, catalyzing diversification and resulting in growth. And in a way, I'm not saying anything new in some ways here. This is not like an earth-shattering news, right? Because if you look at, even since I've been here, even in the last month or so, President Putin kind of said something very similar at the VTB conference. Prime Minister Medvedev said something very similar at Sochi. So there is a recognition that this is the case, so that basically the policy choices that you make in the period ahead is going to have a big impact, to make a difference between what I would call a re-energized economy or continued stagnation. So what is urgent in our view now is something needs to be done, and that call to do something has never been stronger. So there's that old model has kind of petered out, and now we need the new model, and we need to. That's the source of Russia's future. In our forecast, we have our potential output growth over the medium term in the baseline is about 3.5%. With reform, we think it could be much higher. So for now, given that background, let me start with sort of near-term policy imperatives. Okay? This managing director's global policy agenda that I mentioned kind of gives this overarching perspective. It says, policies in emerging markets should be anchored by appropriate fiscal response and a sound and credible monetary policy framework. So that's what the report says. And in the case of Russia, it also calls for cautious fiscal management to rebuild buffers. So in the fiscal side, that's our big message, right? So despite the economic slowdown and weaker non-oil revenues, the higher than expected oil prices have yielded enough revenue to keep, we project, and I think consistent with Minfin's projection, deficit at about 0.7% of GDP this year. We estimate their non-oil fiscal stance to be broadly neutral this year and perhaps slightly contractionary next year. So the message here on the fiscal side is that given that the output gap is small, it may not be judicious, it may not be useful at this point to consider additional stimulus and measures that would provide, at best, a little impetus to growth, but coming at the risk of kind of introducing inflationary pressures and possible greater exchange rate volatility and policy uncertainty. And given the risks to oil prices, continued, as I said, prudent fiscal management would be the best way to go ahead. As for monetary policy, the CBR, the Central Bank of Russia's policy stance, has remained, we think, appropriate. So it's been mindful of the trade-offs, and this is we can talk about this more. This is an ongoing debate where people have said, they should start lowering rates and so on. But I think that with inflation, there are two things to think about, right? So with rates, there's the output gap and then there's the inflation expectations. And I think the current policy strikes the right balance between the two. And I think the last few policy statements have been very good about explicating those concerns. I mean, inflation has declined, but it still remains at the top of the range, and you know the hold now remains appropriate to anchor. Basically, the order of the day should be to anchor inflation expectations. So until core inflation is firmly on a downward trend, it may not be proper to change rates yet, and I think that's the appropriate step. In addition, sort of this, the incorporation of the mega regulator into the central bank could be a good thing. There's no good model in the world as to what's the best way to do this inside the central bank or outside. UK tried it outside, now moved it inside. There are other models there and there, but in this case, maybe a unified view of banks and non-banks, if possible, would be a welcome development. In this context, I mean, again, what we think is, the recent changes in the central bank toolkit is very, very welcome. The good improvements, like streamlining the liquidity, the toolkit, the interest rate corridor, reforms in the exchange rate, the intervention in the foreign exchange market, the non-intervention in the exchange rate, the ban, and also improved communication, right? And one of the things that I didn't know about before I came here was that the date of the next meeting was never announced before in policy statements. And I think the fact that it is now, at the end of each policy statement, it says when the next meeting is going to be. It's actually a huge improvement in communication because it tells the market to expect when the next policy changes are coming. That's in line with best practices. And that's a good part. So basically, to a large part, the success of an inflation targeting framework that they're heading towards relies on the credibility of the central bank to anchor inflation expectations. And I think these changes go in the direction of preparing Russia to adopt the framework by 2015, as stated. So I've kind of given you a quick rundown of fiscal monetary landscape. So what do we, what's the bottom line, right? So what do we think of the challenges? So the challenge, basically, the growth has slowed down, but this is not something unique to Russia. It's as I said, it's across emerging markets. So the message here is that given very important improvements in the policy framework in Russia in recent years, it's very important to keep those gains, not jeopardize that by sort of succumbing to domestic political pressure for near-term policy stimulus. The challenges that Russia faces, and this is where I'm going to turn to now, are much more sort of longer term in its nature. So given that, our message in the Article 4 in the WEO all along has been in the short term, the output gap remains too small, and any kind of measures to provide stimulus jeopardizes the credibility of the fiscal rule that has just been put in place, could jeopardize the credibility of the inflation targeting framework that will be put in place. So it's best not to try to do something there. But let's turn to the medium-term economic policy priorities, because that's where the action is. So, as I said, Russia needs a new growth model, and this growth, what underlies this growth model, is one that makes better use of the natural advantages in the energy sector. I mean, there is comparative advantage there, given the resources available, but also growing and diversifying the non-oil sector. So as I said, in our baseline, in the no policy change scenario, we only get to about 3.5% in potential output, held back by supply constraints. And so relieving those supply constraints should be the order of the day, and that's where structural reforms are integral. So oil prices are high still, and that provides an opportunity, a window of opportunity to take changes now to do something now that will have impact over the longer run. So again, I mean, what I'm trying to do is point out to you that these challenges that I say here are, it's not just for Russia. Russia is not an exception in the world economy right now. in facing the same challenges. And to underscore that, this idea of faster, stronger growth, higher growth, I mean, we talk about that here, but it's common, especially all across Europe. Just today, in Warsaw, we released our regional economic issues for Central and Southeastern European countries. And the message of that report is basically the same. The Balkans face the same constraint, other countries face the same constraint, and the lessons there are applicable to Russia as well. So let me kind of draw from that report. What I would not want to do is go too much into the Article 4 because it has not been released yet. So I'm trying to link the implications to other reports that are public, and then you can go and see as well. The first lesson was rebuild public buffers. So, again, Russia's non-oil public deficit remains over 10% right now, while the oil price-based fiscal rule is a step in the right direction, as I said. Still leaves the fiscal adjustment over the medium term insufficiently ambitious. It doesn't build. So, again, it doesn't build under current policies and under current fiscal rule. The reserve fund is not built up over the medium term to the level that is desired the state of desire to act as this insurance mechanism. So what we recommend is that so we should have expenditure reductions over the medium term, parametric pension reform. What do I mean by that? One easy payoff there is raising retirement age. I know lots of options are under discussion, but that could be an easy score in that regard. Improving efficiency of budget spending and public-owned enterprises as well. Better assessment of investment spending and oversight. Some of this is going on in Ministry of Finance, reassessment of efficiency of spending and so on. So prioritization would be useful, and gradual privatization of state-owned enterprises, especially those with low price-earning ratios. Privatization agenda has been stated. This year's budget, that was in 2013. The realized privatization receipts have been lower than what was budgeted, and let's see what happens in 2014. But these steps would not only build these buffers, but in some ways, privatization sends a signal. It sends a signal of confidence to kind of catalyze what we need as a private sector involvement, and that can become. The second big lesson is to continue the momentum in monetary policy. So the indications that monetary policy going ahead would be firmly targeted into this inflation targeting framework is totally appropriate. So the appropriate target setting remains important. Judicious use of the toolkit remains important, and what's needed is clear communication. That in IT, if you look at the IT literature, that is one of the crucial things in determining the success or failures of these regimes. Just how communication works to affect inflation expectations over the medium term, and doing that well would again stabilize inflation, deliver a predictable environment, which is what we need to attract external resources. So I know there's a lot of work to be done between now and 2015 to make IT operational, and kind of doing that would be very important. And the last thing that people have noted in this report as well is using finance for growth. So the idea of the well-regulated financial sector, that it remains important for economy is a tautology. So far the focus on rapid credit growth, controlling that, especially in unsecured consumer lending market, is a good thing. In that context, we think further measures like formal ceiling on debt service to income ratios, higher capital requirements for high concentration credit risks may be appropriate. Adopting Basel 2.5 and 3 on schedule is actually it's planned to be on schedule, and that's a good thing. And again, as I said, while we don't have an appropriate model of where the regulators should be, the creation of a mega regulator and maybe hopefully supporting regulations would be a good way to address weaknesses in non-banks. And here, basically, the medium-term agenda should be focused on improving corporate governance, borrower information, creditor rights, and competition in the sector. So these are kind of the three big things. Why do we say that? Underlying this is the objective to ultimately create an investment environment that sort of facilitates broader-based participation. So that's the ultimate goal, where basically you want to have an environment where you are not only attracting foreign capital, but also inducing, incentivizing domestic capital to stay within the borders to take advantage of some, the dynamic engines that come up that may be consistent with Russia's growth. And we can talk about what those dynamic engines could be. You probably know this better than I. Things like technology sector, where the history of high human capital in Russia could be exploited. Even in the energy sector, efficiency gains are possible. So that remains the key challenge. What could be done? Again, reducing the government's footprint through privatization, improving corporate governance, enhancing property rights, and reducing, and this is something that's come up repeatedly when I've talked to investors, is reducing red tape. What do I mean by that? Is reducing the discretionary powers of public servants and public administration officials in making the decision. So basically, in the end, you want to have an environment that is predictable. What's crucial for investment, if you think about it, is investment is a long-term process. If at time t0, an investor looks at a project, what he or she wants is this steps where you need to have a clear identification, ability to clearly identify a project. Determine due diligence to determine if it was profitable. If so, be able to raise financing for it as needed. Then operate that business in a predictable legal environment. And then, as you make profit, be able to do what you need to do, paying legal taxes and so on, repatriate if needed, and so on and so forth, right? So at T.0, you need to be assured of this whole chain of events. And if you think about investment in infrastructure, which Russia undoubtedly definitely needs, and those are projects that last for years. So you need to have clarity on this stream for a long time. And until that happens, an investor that's looking at investing here versus some other country, the decisions would be determined by that. So in that context, in addition to fulfilling the WTO commitments in 2012, we think what's important is actually using the OECD accession process. We think that could be a very useful tool to kind of, not straitjacket, but to kind of, push the country to move this agenda forward. I mean, some of this has happened in, the effort to increase the doing business indicators, certain, it's a reverse engineering of the index to kind of do better in certain subcomponents, and that's a good thing. At least to improve the environment, and also that there's a spillover effect of that in that the workflows and the processes that are established to get those improvements could then be applied for other improvements. So all of these issues are actually discussed in much greater detail in the coming Article 4, which hopefully tomorrow, if not Monday, most likely Monday, will come out. So let me now, at the very end, I'll take a step back. Oh my God, I've spoken too long. Take a step back and end with some big picture points. Okay? And sort of international language and G20 language, we call it takeaways these days. So what are the messages? First, that global economy remains very subdued, and there are in a downside risk, especially among emerging market economies. So this calls for, now I'm talking broadly, measures to increase the resiliency of the existing policy frameworks and to build buffers to combat possible spillovers and other risks. Second, now looking into Russia, the improvements in the framework in Russia are very welcome, but the imperative is that these gains should be preserved and not resist pressures for for compromising that framework in the near term. But third, the most important then is that the challenge for Russia is the medium term. The focus should be on the medium term. But what that means is take actions now to create an environment that delivers this new growth model, that this new environment where competitive processes can function, and that should deliver Russia on the new growth path. It's easy to say, this is, again, I've said this many times, and it's very easy to say. And then people say, what are structural reforms? What is feasible and what is not feasible is questionable, right? So these are issues where living here, you probably know more of the political constraints and other constraints as to why certain things don't happen. But look forward to your comments and suggestions on maybe even how best we can advance this agenda. One thing I would like to do is also to explore your mind on what do you think the IMF should do in this context. What role the IMF should play here. It's a different role from when Martin was here. When Martin was here, we had a fund-supported program, and the role of the ResRep, the role of the IMF was to ensure that policies were undertaken and to make sure that, and then have dialogues with the authorities in that regard, and to kind of get growth going again. It's a different environment now, right? So there's no monetary relationship now, and we're here purely as let's say we bring expertise from other countries in some ways. So if you're talking about inflation targeting, the IMF team in Turkey has dealt with that for 2 decades now, seeing the highs and the lows. The IMF team in Hungary has done the same. IMF team in Thailand has looked at these issues. And so what we can bring to the table in that regard is saying, look, here are the best practices. Here are the worst practices. Here are what some of the countries did and didn't work out. Here are what some of the countries did that delivered the good message, right? There are these other macro problems, like, how do you, in this context, like many emerging market economies, you can focus on inflation targeting, but exchange rate remains a very important variable. You can move away from exchange rate targeting. You can't target both inflation and exchange rate credibly with one instrument. But how do you do that? You can't just ignore exchange rate. So what have other countries done to manage that? There's something, advice that we can give. Lastly, all these things that I mentioned, the documents, are all available on the IMF website. They're also available on, so we're trying to revamp our website as well. It's www.imf.org/Moscow. If you go there, you'll see a lot of this stuff. When the Article 4 is released on Monday, it'll be there as well. But let me stop here. Thank you again for listening to me for, 30, 40 minutes. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Guys, please go on.
And I promise the next time I come, I'll have fancy presentation slides going up.
Don't be so shy.
So if I could ask a question to the audience, then what do you think as the biggest challenge for medium-term growth? And what's the policy imperative in review for Russia? Would you agree with the state that, in the near term, there isn't much to do? Or is it, some people do say, reducing rates now is a good idea. I don't know what you think about it now. There's so much.
Definitely different time.
Sure.
Because when Martin Gilman, he was always teaching Russian Central Bank that it should never buy treasuries. Now the time changed, and we see that.
Exactly.
Exactly. Not even, European Central Bank, but Fed is buying treasuries. Everyone except Russian Central Bank, which is strict, addicted to the policy announced to him by Martin Gilman.
Now, here again, let me bring up this other issue, which is also an interesting kind of conundrum that we face in Russia now, because of low debt. in public debt in Russia. I mean, speaking of treasuries, I mean, the stock of treasuries is not much. It's actually pretty low. So, the usual form of where they deliver treasuries as collateral to the central bank to get funding, that's not possible here, right? So we've had these measures of non-marketable securities and so on to improve financial intermediation, but that also brings with it risks. The question, with the traditional concept has been that government securities are safe, they're risk-free, whereas some of these non-marketable securities are not. So in terms of policy design, again, for the central bank, how do you design policy to provide liquidity to the market, to provide to affect rates in the long and the short term through the tools that it has without taking on unnecessary risks? And that's also another just a question to throw. I don't pretend to have an answer to it now, so I thought I'd ask you that question before you ask me.
Okay, guys, questions? Okay, please.
15 years ago, IMF was like a creditor of last resort for Russian authorities. Now the times have been changed, and do you finance any projects in Russia? Or
No,
activities in Russia are just limited to advisory and informational services?
So so the thing about the IMF is we don't do project financing, right? That's what distinguishes us from other, from development banks. So the World Bank, the EBRD, others, they finance projects. We are again. This is I gave this talk this morning to two other universities. Our role is to provide balance of payment support to ease the adjustment process, right? So, and as we know in economics, when a crisis hits, if there's no financing, the adjustment has to be very abrupt. So the role of the fund is to provide some financing to ease that adjustment process, and at the same time, in a way, provide the credibility of the fund to announce policy measures so that, say, market financing returns and so on. So no, we don't have. We don't, and obviously we don't lend money to the Russian Federation. Russia has $500 billion of reserves, so foreign exchange is not what it's lacking right now. We do interact with the authorities. We do talk to the central bank, the Minister of Finance, Minister of Economy. The role that we have are, first of all, we organize. There are lots of courses that the IMF organizes for officials on. From things like financial programming, which in our language is the way how different sectors, fiscal, monetary, real, external, interact, and how government finance, how that goes through. How is it if it's financed externally, internally, so that the whole system-wide analysis. We provide training, so officials from institutions can take that, and we as I said, we're kind of like a delivery mechanism of sort of best practices, right? So we. When an issue arises, we provide advice, basically, and we discuss this with the authorities. And in the last year, it was slightly, it was slightly different too. In that, with the G20, we were also providing support in that direction. So the economic analysis, what we think of the world economy at that point, and so on, which was partly my job to coordinate that then.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay.
Mr. Joshi, as you already mentioned, one of the main concerns for Russia is the issue of inflation. So it's interesting to know your view and the IMF view on the origins of inflation in Russia. And another thing that is really interesting for me, why in the United States, considering really proactive Federal Reserve monetary policy, we still do not see surge in inflation, so it's relatively low, and so will it?
Well, in Russia, there are lots of different reasons. There are different reasons that come up for over time. In last year, the agricultural harvest was low, for instance, right? So the prices in agriculture were high. So as a result, inflation shot up. and it's coming down now because this year relatively there's better harvest. So and their components are coming down. I mean, the concern here is that core inflation is coming down, but not as fast. Right? So that's where, I mean, this is where the message to of the central bank is that they would monitor this and stand put until the inflation expectations are firmly grounded and firmly going down. In the U.S., I mean, it's the aggregate demand story, right? It's not just the U.S. Euro area has the same thing. I mean, Japan has been mired in low inflation for decades, despite massive kind of participation by the central bank, and Krugman calls it the liquidity gap. Right? So it's that story. So I mean, there, given that, actually, the fund message so far is, look, the withdrawal of these unconventional monetary policies, the talk is actually a good thing, in that the reason there's even a talk of the U.S. withdrawing is because there are talks of, in the prospects of U.S. growing again, and which is good for the world economy, right? But basically, to do that, any move should be sort of well-timed, well-calibrated, and well-communicated, is I think what the way our MD, managing director, put it. Because as we saw, some miscommunication or misunderstanding can lead to impacts, as we saw in May. And at the same time, for the emerging markets, I mean, some emerging markets will have an impact going forward, in the sense that basically in May there's this impact. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, you saw that the countries with the highest external financing needs were the ones that were the most impacted. And going forward, given that the withdrawal is coming at some point, we have time for these countries. The message that we have in the WIO and the GFSR for emerging markets is we have time now for these countries to take steps to go towards more flexible exchange rates, to allow exchange rates to function, to improve institutions further when needed, and so on. And in that case, we, again, to go back to the first question, the role of the fund, since 2008, we've seen a massive increase in resources of the fund. So, we have resources available to lend to countries, and we have also improved our toolkit in the sense that we not only have what's called the standby arrangement with Russia had, but we also have these insurance mechanisms like flexible credit line or a precautionary liquidity line. Flexible credit line is something that, say, Mexico has used since 2008. So it's meant for countries with very strong fundamentals as an insurance, as an insurance against contagion. So if something happens, and the economy is all connected. So even if you have good policies, given that there are international, external finance involved and so on, if something happens, of the Lehman scale, there could be outflows. So measures like the FCL and the PLL they're there, available to countries should they need it in the period ahead. So that those are sort of the possible responses to any of the tapering.
Other questions? Okay, please.
You said that Russia needs a new model of economic growth. So how do you think, what main drivers of this growth should we use firstly? Do you think that we should make some institutional change in political system, or we should develop financial markets firstly? How do you think?
No, I think underlying all of this is the investment climate. I mean, basically, a lot of what you said, if measures are taken to improve the investment climate, and I don't pretend to be an expert on what they are. The measures have been taken, but there's, the sort of improved corporate governance, minority shareholder rights, property rights, and so on. And as they're strengthened, not just legally, but the implementation of them as well. In that way, you would have more participation, right? Equity market participation in Russia has fallen sharply in recent years. that could go up, right? So that's another engine where you get capital for firms in Russia, and I don't mean to do like a growth accounting exercise and tell you, what's the productive sector, because in a way, it harkens back to kind of the planning environment where people make mistakes, right? It's not your policymakers are not the maybe I sound too like free market here, but policymakers don't have the capability. Let's just put it this way to determine what's best and what's not. Right? So it's what we're saying is create a facilitating environment where predictability, rights, are in place, and that would allow. I mean, Russia has potential. I mean, it's a rising middle class with high income, pretty large economy, spans. I mean, I tell people at the fund that I represent the largest portion of the world for the IMF, right? So basically 1/6 of the population is 1/6 of the land mass of the world is I'm the resident representative for. So I mean it's a big area. So right, there's the Asian market, there's the European market, there's the Eastern European market. So there's no particular model. There are different competitive advantages in different areas. Far East could be natural resources, properly managed, could be a source of growth. In sort of educated sectors, I was being told today in Novosibirsk, it's a huge intellectual capital. Perhaps IT and so on could be the source of growth there. I don't mean to sort of say, whatever. When I worked on Uzbekistan, and I was told Uzbekistan had the best maintained. I worked on Uzbekistan in 2002, and I was told Uzbekistan had the best maintained aircrafts because in the Soviet times that's where the servicing was located. So when the Soviet Union broke up, they had that comparative advantage. And I don't mean to imply that denote this area as that, denote that area as that. That's where the facilitating environment comes in. So when that happens, if people have the right to have the incentive to invest, presumably they would. And government plays a role. I'm not saying you just step back. Infrastructure is something where government plays a huge role. Roads, train lines are important. And through PPP, let's say, by limiting risks to the budget, you can have a thing where the government identifies a project, identifies it as economically viable, and then takes risks in areas where it has advantages in taking risks, and then allows the private sector to come in and take risks in those areas where it has an informational advantage. So it sounds like I'm saying just stuff, but in a way it's hard to say. Like I don't want to say, A in city A, B in city B, and D in city C.
Okay, other questions? Okay, please.
For your presentation. It was very informative for us. So I have a question about the mega regulators. So recently this project was ratified, and as it's said to be that if someone wants to see the economic growth, so the government should free the government intervention in business in any way of economic growth. So the government should free the labor flow, anyway, doesn't intervene in economy. So I want to just know that point of view of IMF about the mega regulators.
No, well, I don't mean government should step out of everything. I think it's the idea is, the model is that you create a facilitating environment, but you have an environment where the government acts as a regulator. You need to maintain regulations, right? But you're a fair regulation across the sector. So that's in labor, of course. You don't want the government to step out and labor be exploited beyond belief, right? So So there's a role for government in that regard. And in terms of mega regulator, yes, financial sector is a source of growth, but financial sector needs regulation, as we learned, quite painfully just 5 years ago. And then since then, globally, things have happened as well, but not, again, not in the pace that we would like, right? We still have, there are various measures that, again, if you look at the G20, so where there have been delays, and those things need to be done. And in the case of Russia, that's, again, whether the regulator stays within the central bank or outside, what's best is not predetermined. But now that the decision has been made to put it in, regulating, sort of extending the shadow of the borders of regulation to control the shadow banking and so on in a non-bank sector, insurance, so on, is a good thing. And I think that could be done. And I think, as far as I know, the implementation, so that the rules out there, but the implementation guidelines are being formed. And I think we'll see how that's going to happen. Knowing some of the personalities, I'm kind of confident that they could do it. They're very smart people there, but let's see. But financial sector, among others, but even beyond others, is something that needs a prudent regulation.
As I heard, you said also about that Russia needs some external sources. So does it implement the regulators for the external source? For example, can make a regulator effect on external resources for coming into Russia?
What do you mean in that sense?
As I understood, the investment for Russia is not effective right now. Yes, maybe some regulators is like affecting or being not effective.
No, actually, there's a lot of studies on sort of the role of financial regulators in investment as well. One of the thing about that is it brings predictability, right? So a well-behaved regulator also brings with it assurances that rules and regulations will be adhered to. That things will not be ad hoc. And in terms of external resources for the financial sector, again, if you know that the regulators are going to be fair, bound by rules, follow the rules, at the same, that's actually a positive for that sector, I would say.
Other questions? That's all. Okay, Bikas, thank you very much. It was our pleasure to meet you in the High School of Economics.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So let me know if you have questions on the IMF. I'm here to kind of spread the gospel of working for the IMF as well, especially among intelligent people. So if you have interest, do let me know, and hopefully we'll have other chances to talk about these things in the period ahead. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.